Glad you're here today. Before we get into the message, I have a quick announcement for you. Our children's ministry had, I always use old terms, our next gen ministry had this amazing PJs and pancake thing on Saturday, but what I love best about it is in their creativity, they came up with a way to really connect our families with what's going on in La Violeta, Ecuador. And it was a real interactive experience. There were games and things like that. I have a quick announcement about that, video announcement, then I'm going to follow up with that, okay? So let's watch this first.
Church, I want to tell you about an amazing experience. It's called A Ticket Out of Poverty, and it is the dream child of our Knock 'em Out of the Park Next Gen team. They came up with an experience to help our families here better understand what's going on in Ecuador and why we're supporting the indigenous youth to get an education. So this is an interactive experience here, shows the children what it's like to live on $2.66 a day, show them what little they can buy with that money, show them what it's like to live in the rural area where only half the people have access to potable water. There's games that they can play that illustrate how that only 1 in 100 children in the rural areas that apply to college will ever be accepted. I mean, this is amazing what they've come up with. I wish the whole church could experience it. It's happening on Saturday morning. Well, it happened on Saturday morning, so you missed it. But I just want you to know that I believe this is going to turn on our families to what's going on in the Southern Hemisphere in Ecuador. One of the things I really love are these cards, and there's about a half a dozen, and they're left over. And these are available this weekend. You can pick them up. These are students in the program, actual students we're supporting right now. On the back is their life story, a little bit about what their challenges are and how you can pray for them. This is a program that we've been involved with now for about 4+ years. We've already served more than 500 people in this tiny community, making a difference. I tell people all the time, this is the long game against poverty. This is how you win. You give people an education, and it changes them for life. So it's Christmas time, friends. I hope that you're going to dig deep. I hope that you'll consider making a difference for somebody less fortunate than you, and that you'll consider doing something beyond a turkey and a toy that'll either be eaten today or played with today and forgotten tomorrow. Invest in an education in a child, because education is the one thing we never lose, and it can change somebody's life forever.
So I didn't want you to miss out on this, so I asked the Next Gen team to keep all the stuff together, and we're going to set it up in the auditorium next week, because I want you to see not just the hard work they put into this, but I want you to be exposed to why this community just really rocked our hearts. One of the statistics they found is that in the rural areas, 30% of children drop out of school after the 5th grade to go home and work and help to provide income for the family. Can you imagine your kids completing elementary school and having to go to work? And when I say having to go to work, I'm talking about they're typically running in between cars in traffic and washing windows, selling fruits and vegetables, trinkets, things like that. This is a community that is really deeply impacted by the gifts you make. So, this year, if it's a bonus, if you're just feeling sacrificial, if you just like to consider, if I had another kid around the Christmas tree, I would want to make sure they had a share like my own children. Would you give in that kind of way so that we really make a difference in this community? These cards are all out in the main lobby on a table. You'll see them on your way out, and you'll notice they're all female right now in the program. I don't know about you, but I believe especially in giving girls an education. Our young women just shine. Pick up these cards, pray for them. In my book, I wrote, poverty has to have a name, a face, and an address. Nobody cares about the nameless, faceless poor. Nobody cares about the statistics around poverty. But you know what? I care about Alexandra. I do. She's real, a flesh and blood human being, and your giving right now is making a huge difference in her life. So I hope you'll pray about that, make a difference with the rest of the families. We're continuing our series, Just Jesus. We're looking at the 4 Gospels. Last week we looked at Matthew. Today we're going to look at Mark in the Suffering Servant. During the month of December, I think that collectively, the American culture, our society, suffers from what I call Christmas amnesia. And what I mean by that is people tend to isolate the birth of Jesus from the rest of the Bible. Then when December is over, we box him all up with all the Christmas wrapping and pictures and bows and trees and put him back into the attic for another year. And that's a huge mistake, because the Christmas story goes beyond the birth of a baby. It goes far beyond the month of December. It goes past the days of Advent. Christ coming into the world was the miracle of all miracles. C.S. Lewis said it best. He said, the central miracle of Christianity is the incarnation, God becoming human flesh. They say that God became man. Every other miracle prepares for this, or exhibits this, or results from this. Lewis is dead on. What happened at Christmas was just the beginning of it all. It was the opening chapter in the story. It's the initiating act. But the true Christmas story, as you're going to see in today's message, is just as appropriate on a hot summer day as it is on a cold December night. So if you were here with us last week, I talked to you about what I called the dark side of the Christmas story, because this is Matthew's perspective. He tells a side of the Christmas story that we don't put on our Christmas cards, that we don't talk about in our little books that we read to children. But he talks about the reality, how the Christ child was threatened with rejection from the get-go, even before he was born. First by Joseph, who thought that maybe Mary had been unfaithful to him and was thinking about putting her and the son away and not having anything to do with him. After he's born, you have this maniacal Herod, the king over the Jews, who's going to do everything irrationally to wipe out the toddler Jesus before he can even come of age. Matthew's Christmas story is real, and it's gritty, and it's dark. But it lets us know that Christmas goes beyond that once-in-a-lifetime or once-upon-a-time feel. This week, we're going to see another side of the story. And I promise you, probably 90% of the people in this room have not heard Christmas from this point of view, from Mark's perspective. And we're going to get into that, but I want to remind you of something I said to you last week. We talked about this word behold, that we want to really behold Jesus, that our purpose, our intention, all this month of December is to strip away all the non-essentials and just zero in on who is Jesus and why he came. And this word behold, it's a beautiful biblical word, and it's got like 4 different dimensions or facets to it. One is, if I really behold Jesus, I want to know him. I want to know it. I want to know everything I can know about him. I want to dig deep. I want to master every fact. I want to read about his life. I want to take it all in. And also, I want to absorb it. I want it to saturate my being like worship does. I want his person to fill up my senses, if you will. But also, I want to experience it. I don't want your experience of Jesus. I want my own experience with Jesus. I don't want a secondhand knowledge. I want to know him firsthand for myself. And third, I want to be changed by him. I don't want to leave this place the same person I came in. I want to have, after having beheld Jesus, I want to know that something has shifted inside that's never going back to the way it was before. So if I were to summarize Mark's telling the Christmas story, I would say that he tells us the Christmas story as a metaphor. You should know right up front, there is nothing in the Gospel of Mark about Jesus' birth or his childhood. Instead, Mark plunges immediately into the public ministry of Jesus. In the few short opening paragraphs of this book, we hear about the role of John the Baptist as the forerunner, the baptism of Jesus, and the temptation in the wilderness. Before we can even catch our breath, Jesus launches his ministry, announces the kingdom, calls his 12 disciples. Then it leads to his campaign of preaching and healing and casting out demons. That's all in Mark chapter 1. That's not going into the book. That's the opening salvo. So it leads to an important question, though, and the question is, can you have Christmas without a crib? So first, let me say this. The Gospels are not biographies. They don't tell us everything we'd like to know about Jesus. They don't even necessarily report on every significant life event. What they choose to include, they also choose things not to include. There's a reason behind the ordering of the stories, why they come the way they come. And as a reader, we're supposed to figure that out. Why do they write? Why do they put these stories together? Second, it's really important when you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that you read them from a Jewish point of view. Now, I understand Mark was written to the Romans largely, and that affects what he includes and excludes. Matthew was written largely to a Jewish audience. It affects what he includes and excludes. But you need to understand all four of these gospel writers are Jews. And so they write from a Jewish worldview with Jewish traditions and teaching in mind. And if you don't read the Gospels through a Jewish set of eyes, I promise you, you're going to miss out on a lot of stuff. Now, let me explain why this is important. When Mark's Gospel opens up, he intentionally chooses some things that would take us back in our minds and our hearts back to the Exodus, all the way back to Egypt. And any Jewish person reading the Gospel of Mark would have picked up on these nuances. Now, you and I may not, because we're not Jewish and we don't think like Jewish people. We don't see things through Jewish eyes, but they most definitely would. So let me set some context. Toward the end of the Old Testament, it's a really dark time. It's often called the Exile because God's people had been exiled in Babylon, a foreign country 700 miles east of Jerusalem. God's people had been held there for a long time. And then there's this pilgrimage back. It's led by Ezra and Nehemiah. You've probably read those books. They're rebuilding the city, rebuilding the wall. So you could say that God's people were home, but it doesn't really feel like home yet. They're home, but they're not home. So fast forward from that point, from Malachi, the last book in the Old Testament, to the time of Mark, and that's 400 years. 400 years, the Jewish people are living in Jerusalem, but it still doesn't feel like home. Why? Because they're under a foreign power, an occupier by the name of Rome. Rome dictates everything about their life, takes their money in taxation. They're miserable under the thumb of Rome. So they're home, but it still doesn't feel like home. Does that make sense? So this is what's going on at this time. And then what Mark does is he chooses a couple of verses, one from Malachi and one from Isaiah 40. And these verses are about God coming to bring his exiled people home. And he quotes from Isaiah 40 that basically says, make way, prepare the way of the Lord. And this is the message of John the Baptist. John the Baptist is out in the wilderness. He's saying, make way, prepare the way of the Lord, which is Mark's way of saying God is coming in person to defeat our enemies and lead us home. The day we've anticipated forever when we will finally be free has finally arrived. But remember this, being in exile, when you read about being in exile, whether you're talking about the Egyptian bondage or whether you're talking about Babylon or being under Rome, being in exile is not just about your circumstances. It's a bigger statement about spiritually that the people are in exile from God. If you don't understand that, you miss a lot of meaning because the people are far away from God. This is part of the reason why they are in exile. So this really big picture in Mark chapter 1 is God taking decisive action to end the exile of his people, to bring them back home to his heart. Because that's where our first home is, isn't it? It's not in this world anyway. It's in the heart of God. And isn't that the Christmas message? That the human race, in a sense, is living in exile from God? That we're exiles and we all long to go home, so Jesus comes into our broken world to bring those who are far away near, to bring us back to the heart of God. That's how Mark begins. But now Mark is going to show them how God is going to do that. And this is where having a Jewish set of eyes really matters. I call this the echoes of the Exodus. The verse says, at that time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. Just as Jesus was coming up out of the water, he saw heaven being torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, you are my Son, whom I love, with whom I am well pleased. At once the Spirit set him out into the wilderness, and he was in the wilderness for 40 days. Being tempted by Satan, he was with the wild animals, and angels attended him. Now, typically, if you're a student of the Bible, you like to study the Bible, what you do is you look at a verse like this, and you look at it in great detail, and you search out the meaning of words, and you might even bring in other verses to help you understand that. That's a great way to study the Bible. Nothing wrong with that. But sometimes you got to step back and get the view from 10,000 feet. You got to get the big picture of what's going on so all the little pieces make sense and how they come together. And this is really important in Mark chapter 1. Honestly, there's some stuff in this chapter most of us miss. And I say that because as a preacher and a student of the Bible for all my life, I missed this for most of my life. So what I want to do is I want to walk you through some things I discovered in Mark chapter 1, and then we'll put all the pieces together in the end. So really big picture, the 10,000-foot view, if you will. Mark wants us to understand that Jesus is coming to set up his kingdom, and how he does that, he shows us that Jesus is actually reenacting and recreating the establishment of the nation of Israel back in the Exodus. If you've never seen this before, it will be obvious by the time we're all done, and you'll not unsee it. So here is my first clue. As I'm reading through this chapter, and I read these verses I just read to you, I see that Jesus spends 40 days in the wilderness being tested, just like the people in the Exodus spent 40 years in the wilderness being tested. And come to find out that the temptation in the wilderness that Christ faces is exactly the same temptation that Israel faced in the wilderness. Remember how Israel was so unhappy with God's provision of manna, their daily bread. They grumbled, they complained all the time about it, right? So they failed the manna test. Jesus faces the same temptation. He's hungry like they were. The enemy comes to him in his hunger and tells him to turn stones into bread. Basically, Satan says, make your own manna. But Christ says, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. So Jesus succeeds where Israel failed. But that's not the only connection to the Exodus story. It's not a coincidence that John the Baptist is said to be in the wilderness and baptizing people in the Jordan River. These two places are two very significant places in Israel's history. Number one, the wilderness is the place where they were tested. And two, the Jordan River is what they had to cross to enter the promised land. So Mark didn't pick these stories by accident, didn't place them side by side without intention. This is the Exodus story. This is the new Exodus. Jesus is coming to establish his rule among his people. But there's even more to it than that. Remember how before Jesus goes into the wilderness, the Bible says he's first baptized by John. So he's baptized by John, then he goes into the wilderness. When the children of Israel left Egypt to go to the promised land, what was their first big obstacle? The Red Sea, right? Remember how Moses, he's standing there and he puts out the rod and the sea parts and the people pass through on dry land. You remember that story? True story. It happened right in the Bible. Okay, so the Apostle Paul, writing about that episode in Israel's history in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, wrote this. Listen, for I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud, and they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. So what Paul tells us is when the children of Israel passed through the Red Sea, that was in effect their mass baptism by God. They're passing through the Red Sea. So they're baptized by God, then they go into the wilderness. Jesus is baptized by John, and he goes into the wilderness. Again, same story. He's recreating the story of God's people. But once again, there's more. Something else really significant about the Exodus. Do you remember how much time the children of Israel spent in slavery in Egypt? 400 years. Do you know how much time elapsed between Malachi, the last prophet of the Old Testament, and the Gospel of Mark? 400 years. Now remember I told you, exile is not about a place. It's not about your circumstances. Exile is first and foremost spiritually that we're estranged from God, that we're exiled from the heart of God. There's been 400 years without a prophet of God. 400 years between the testaments where God is not speaking to the people. And then all of a sudden, God has now shown up after 400 years of silence because he wants to end the exile of his people and be reunited with them. Here's another similarity. Jesus' name in Hebrew, Yeshua. In the Old Testament, you know who Yeshua is? Joshua. Even sounds the same, doesn't it? That Joshua and Jesus, it's the same name. So Jesus is named Joshua. Who is Joshua? Joshua is the leader who, after the 40 years of desert wandering, leads the people across the Jordan and into the promised land. So Mark tells us that Yeshua, Jesus, is about to lead his people in the promised land. After the time of testing, the first thing that Jesus does after announcing the kingdom is he chooses disciples. How many does he choose? 12. Just like the 12 tribes of Israel. Jesus is gathering the nucleus of the new Israel. By the way, the Gospel of Matthew uses this same imagery in its introduction. I didn't go into this last week, but I told you that when Herod decides he's going to slaughter all the innocents in Bethlehem, the Holy Family, Mary, Joseph, and the baby, have to flee. They go to another country, and what country is that? Egypt. So Jesus, the Son of God, comes out of Egypt. So I've given you a lot of details. Now let me put it all together for you. After 400 years of silence from God, the same amount of time the people of God spent in Egypt, Jesus comes out of Egypt just like Israel did. He's baptized in the water just like the children of Israel when they crossed the Red Sea. He's sent into the wilderness to be tested for 40 days like they were tested for 40 years. He faces exactly the same temptations they did, but he's victorious where they failed. He came out of the wilderness, announces his kingdom, the same kingdom that Israel rejected. Then he chooses his 12 tribes to form the heart of a new nation and then goes about the work of the kingdom. You see why it's important to read the gospel with Jewish eyes? Because this is all there. It's all right there in Mark chapter 1. That's the opening chapter. It's Mark's version of the Christmas story. So even though someone may be correct in saying, well, you know, there's no Christmas story in Mark, they may be right in saying, you know, there's no shepherd, there's no wise men, there's no manger. But, you know, they're wrong if you think about what this story's really saying. Christmas story is the story of God coming into the world to save people from spiritual exile. And if that's what Christmas really is, and it is, then I would say that Mark actually has the best, clearest, and most compelling Christmas story in all the Gospels. So if you look at the rest of the Gospel of Mark, there's only 2 questions that define this book, and it splits it right in half. The first 8 chapters ask the question, who is Jesus? The second set of 8 chapters ask the question, and what is he here to do? Why did he come? So the first one is about the identity of Jesus. Who is he? And one of the strange things about this gospel, if you've ever just picked it up to read it, I remember the first time I just read it cover to cover, I thought, why does Jesus keep telling people to be quiet when he does something for them or they recognize who he is? Like the demons, you know, they come out and they say, oh, you're the Son of God, you know, the Messiah. And Jesus says, shut up, right? He does a miracle for people. He says, don't tell anybody. And what happens in Mark, it's only the demons and it's women and it's all these people on the peripheral of the story that seem to understand, that seem to really get who Jesus is, but Jesus doesn't want them to tell anybody. And Mark never explains why Jesus says this, but it's going to become obvious by the time we're done today. And the key is a strange miracle few people understand. So the Gospel of Mark is filled with miracles, but there's one miracle in this gospel that's not like the others. Jesus goes to heal a blind man. And something happens in this miracle that's never happened before. Do you remember this story? The man is only partially healed. And Jesus asked the man, do you see anything? Jesus has never had to ask a question to follow up on a miracle before. Any other miracle, it's been instantaneous, spontaneous, complete every time he's done it. But this time, the healing doesn't seem to take. I'm sure you've seen this story before. Look at this verse. Jesus asked, do you see anything? He looked up and said, I see people. They look like trees walking around. So what's that about? Well, let me tell you, I believe with all my heart Jesus does this on purpose, and I'll explain that. But first let me say, spiritually speaking, we're all Mr. Magoo. You remember Mr. Magoo? Mr. Magoo was a cartoon, this elderly retiree, short little fat guy that was nearsighted and refused to wear his glasses, much like my wife, but don't tell her I said that. Anyway, refuses to wear his glasses, so he's getting himself into all kinds of trouble all the time. This is our problem too. Like the blind man, we see, but we don't see clearly. And by the way, this is not a metaphor about Jesus' enemies. This is an indictment of his friends. It's important for you to understand, being an insider, even being a disciple, is no guarantee that you fully understand everything you should be understanding. And proximity to Jesus is no guarantee that you see him clearly. And that's why I love the fact that Jesus heals this blind man in 2 stages. If Jesus had left him the way he was, he would have spent the rest of his life saying hi to trees or trying to chop down people, and that wouldn't have been good. But by the way Jesus does this miracle, it gives me hope. Because like the partially healed man, that's a commentary on our life. Sometimes we don't see everything we should be seeing. And there are many times in my life I've looked back and I thought, how could I have been so blind for so long? Have you ever had that experience? How could I have not seen that? I mean, it's just obvious. It's as obvious as nose on your face. Or sometimes I'm reading the Bible and I think, why did I never see that before? I've read that 100 times and I never saw it before this moment. A lot of us are like this partially healed man. So if I were to summarize this experience, I would say this person experienced a miracle and still couldn't see clearly. Now, Jesus does go ahead and complete the healing, so don't get worried that he just left him like that, okay? But this idea that you could see a miracle and still not see clearly is a really important idea to Jesus, because that's the only thing that's been happening in the Gospel of Mark. The disciples have seen every single miracle Jesus performed, and they still can't see clearly who he is. They see, but they don't really see. So the blind man is an object lesson for his disciples. And I'll explain more about that in a minute. So this gospel Mark moves immediately from that story to what is the climactic moment in the Gospel of Mark. And I call this next point the deeper meaning we can't see. So the identity of Jesus, who is Jesus, is a key question in the Gospel of Mark. Everything up to this point, to chapter 8, is asking the question again and again, who is he? Now, to the crowds, Jesus is a fascinating man. They're intrigued by him. They want to know more. To the religious leaders, Jesus is an infuriating man. He drives them up a wall. He doesn't fit their mold. He disregards their rituals. They think he's filled with a demon. To his family, he's an embarrassing man. They think he's lost his mind. And they try even one time to attempt to bring him home by force. And to the disciples, the ones who should understand it best, the ones who should really get it, they're really confused about who Jesus is. Like the blind man, they see, but not clearly. So we come to this huge question that Jesus wants to know. He asks the disciples, who do people say I am? And they answer it this way. Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets. So when the people, the average person, thinks about Jesus and who he is, they answer in terms of someone significant from Israel's past. Some say, well, he followed John the Baptist. John the Baptist was killed by this point in Mark chapter 8. Maybe he's just John the Baptist come back to life. And others say, no, he must be Elijah, because Elijah is the one who's supposed to show up before the Messiah gets here. That's got to be Elijah. And others said, no, he's not him at all. He's just one of the other prophets like Isaiah or Jeremiah or Ezekiel. But you know what all those answers have in common? They assign Jesus to the role of one who prepares the way for someone greater. It's like the average person is saying, Jesus is great and all, but when does the real guy get here? That's how people are seeing Jesus. So Jesus asked a more pointed question to his disciples. Who do you say that I am? And even though the question was put to them all, it's Peter who answered, you are the Messiah. Peter believes Jesus is the Christ, the anointed one, the one promised by God, the one about whom God said the office of prophet, priest, and king would all come together in one person, and that is Jesus. Peter finally sees, right? He finally sees who Jesus actually is. For the first time, a veil has been lifted. Or I might better say, they finally almost get it. You see, they get the Messiah part. They really do. They can see, but they don't see everything they're supposed to see. And there's one thing they don't get at all, and this is next point, the mission of Jesus. Why did he come? You see, once Peter makes his bold confession, from this point on, everything is about the cross. In Mark 8, 9, and 10, there's 3 different verses where Jesus talks about the cross and what it means and where his life is heading. It all climaxes in Mark 10:45 when he says, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many. Jesus said, I'm the suffering servant. My death will be the sacrifice necessary to pay for sins and restore human beings to a right relationship with God. In other words, Jesus needs them to understand the way of the cross. So once Peter makes this amazing confession, this announcement who Jesus is, Jesus then drills down with them and says this. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. So now that they realize who he is, he begins to teach them what he has to do. What you need to understand is Jesus has not taught them any of this before this time. He's not taught them about suffering and being rejected and dying on the cross. Why? Because they don't even understand who he is yet. Until they understand who he is, they can't come to understand what he's come to do. And so once they have the epiphany, if you will, then all of a sudden now Jesus says, now I'm free. I can tell you why I'm here. Well, the problem is this didn't set well with the disciples, and Peter in particular, because you see, Peter had his own ideas about what Messiah would be. And so the Bible says this, Peter took Jesus aside, and began to rebuke him. Now, we don't know. We have no record of what Peter said to Jesus, but I have a feeling it went something like this. Jesus, now look me in the eye. Look me in the eye and repeat after me. I am the Messiah. I am not going to be defeated. I'm going to defeat my enemies. We get it now, Jesus. You don't have to play coy with us anymore. You're the anointed one, the Christ. Now let's go knock out some teeth. It probably went something like that because that was the general expectation of the Messiah. He's the conqueror. He's going to throw off Rome, right? So how does Jesus feel about Peter's little pep talk? He rebuked Peter. Get behind me, Satan, he said. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Let me tell you something. It's going to be a bad day if Jesus has to call you Satan to get you to shut up. You know, it's just not, the conversation's not going up from there. Why does Jesus respond so harshly? Because he's a man on a mission. He knows why he came. He knows what he's supposed to do. And his face is set to the cross. And that means that not even well-intentioned Peter is going to get in the way of God's purpose for his life. So back to that story of the blind man. The disciples see that Jesus is the Messiah, but do they understand what kind of Messiah he is? They don't. Not at all. And that's clear from Peter's rebuke of Jesus. Just like the miracle, they see but not clearly. Jesus does a partial healing on purpose. It's not that Jesus was having a bad day or an off day in healing. It's not that he healed and it took some time for the guy to get used to it. I've heard all kinds of crazy explanations for this. He's giving the disciples a living, breathing object lesson about what's going on inside of them. He's holding up a mirror saying, this is you. You see, but you don't see clearly, not the way you should. So in the midst of this conversation, do you remember what Jesus said to him? Jesus warned them not to tell anybody about him. So we're back to the secrecy thing again. My question is, why keep it a secret? I mean, they finally get it. They understand Jesus is the Messiah. Why doesn't Jesus want the disciples going around saying, hey, this is the Christ, the Messiah, the one we're supposed to follow? Because Jesus doesn't want his disciples going town to town, spreading their idea of what the Messiah should be. They see, but they don't see clearly. And Jesus doesn't want that poison to be out there before they get to sort through the real Jesus, because that's not the real Jesus. You know, there's hundreds of churches. There are hundreds of churches filled with people who do just that. They like Jesus. They're fascinated with Jesus. They're familiar with a lot of the things he said and what he did. But they really don't know him. They really don't see him clearly. Just like these original disciples, they've created their own picture of Jesus. And so churches are filled with people who believe in a caricature of Jesus, an exaggerated, distorted image of Jesus as some kind of love and peace guru, the Messiah who never offends anybody, the Messiah that fits into all their political partisan views no matter what they are. They see him, but they don't see him clearly. You know why? Because they don't behold him. They don't want to know everything there is to know about him. To literally drowned in the person of Christ, to absorb everything about him, to actually reflect on his life and what the Gospels have to say, to experience that and be changed by it. And until you really behold who Jesus is, you carry within yourself a distorted image, your own picture of Jesus. It's our Jesus of our imagination, but it's not the Jesus of the Bible. And this is why Jesus says this. He says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever wants to lose their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What he's saying is if you want to be my disciples, not only must you embrace the way of the cross as my way, God is sending me to a cross. God is sending me, that's my purpose, that's why I'm here. But you've got to embrace a cross-styled life, which means that we're not the most important thing on this earth, that we love who he loves and we do what he does. Somewhere along the line, the church decided that we could accept Christ in his death and not follow him in his life. This is why spreading an unclear picture of Jesus is such a dangerous thing to do, and why he tells his disciples, don't tell anybody. Could you imagine what would have happened had the image, the distortions in their mind about Jesus taken root before people understood why Jesus really came? And could it be that maybe even some of us in this room, the image we have of Jesus, though it's very nice, is just not real? We want a Jesus who lets us do like we like, and at the end of the day says a good time was had by all. That's exactly what C.S. Lewis said a lot of us have in our God image. We just want a Jesus that rubber stamps our life. We want to reinvent a Jesus that suits us. We want smorgasbord or buffet spirituality, where I just choose the stuff I like and I leave everything else on the buffet. Mark says, I'm not going to let you do that. You know, Mark is Peter's gospel, by the way. Every scholar believes that this is Peter's recollection. This is why it moves so fast. It's a gospel of action because it reflects who Jesus is and who Peter is. And so Peter wants us to know, listen, I really messed it up. I had the wrong idea about Jesus. And he relentlessly confronted me about that idea. You see, the idea about Jesus, he's not the Jesus of my imagination and my personal preferences. He's the Jesus who's come to exile people everywhere to bring them home to the heart of God. I told you, exile is not a condition, a circumstance. It's our relation of our heart to God. You see, a lot of us, we have our exile. Some people are living in exile because they're living with an addiction, and it's an active addiction. Maybe it's drugs, maybe it's alcohol, maybe it's sex, maybe it's relationship. I don't know what it is. But I know this, that addiction has taken more from you than you could possibly ever imagine, and you feel very far from God. You want to find a home with God again. There's some people in this room right now, you're living in exile because you come off of a string of bad relationships, and it seems like with every single one, your self-esteem and your sense of worth has just been pounded into the ground. And you feel completely alone, and you feel completely dejected. And you just want to find that sense of being at home again, right? Well, this is the promise of the gospel, that Jesus comes to our exiles in our broken world to bring us home to our true home. Some of us, we live in exile because of the family we grew up in. Some of us live in exile because of church experiences we've had. Because there are churches that are quite toxic, that use as their staple guilt and shame and run people's self-worth into the ground and make them feel like God is mad at them all the time. Friends, I want you to know that Jesus is on a rescue mission. He came just like Mark did. He's setting up a brand new nation. It's called the church, the people of God, his community. And he's bringing everybody who's far away near. And he says, find your home in my heart. And the way you do that is you not only see who I am, you see what I came to do, and you understand why that's so necessary, and you want it for yourself. Jesus' message to me was, you're in exile. You're far from me, and I want you to find a home in my heart. And I said yes to him many years ago. I hope you will too. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for the powerful message in the Gospel of Mark, that Jesus has come, has recreated history, has done it right. He's gathered together a new people, everybody who's far away, everyone who's estranged, everyone who feels like they're in exile, everyone who struggles with the feeling, I'm not home yet. I don't feel at home. I don't feel at home in my own skin. I don't feel at home in my own apartment, my own living room. I don't feel at home anywhere I go. God, you've come to bring the exiled home to your heart, where we all truly belong. So if someone doesn't know you in a personal relationship, help them right now to just say, God, I finally get it. I see what I couldn't see before. I see that not only are you the unique Son of God, but that you came to pay the price for my sins so that I could be reconciled for you. And I pray, God, that you would come into my life, that you would forgive me of my sins, that you would make of me a new creature, and that you'd help me to understand this more. As best I know how, I give you my life, and I want to follow you as a Christian. And for those of us who are believers, may we see as we've never seen. May we behold Jesus. May we see him in his majesty, in his truth, in his totality. I pray it in Christ's name. Amen.